You're in Jerusalem in the year 28 CE. A disciple of Jesus approaches you and says, Jesus is risen, but it's before he was crucified. How can that be? In today's video, I'll be taking a look at how the gospel writers may have taken figurative terms used to describe the teachings of Jesus and turned them into literal events. To start, let's take a look at how the motif of light versus darkness is used by Paul. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul addresses concerns from the Thessalonians who feared they had not received all the knowledge they needed. His opponents had sown doubt, suggesting that their lack of full understanding would place them against God on the day of the Lord. Paul reassures them, affirming that they are not in darkness and had all the knowledge they needed. Paul refers to them as sons of light and not sons of darkness. If you'd like to learn more about 1 Thessalonians, be sure to check out my video series. We find this light versus darkness motif in other writings as well. In the War Scroll, it talks about the sons of light attacking the sons of darkness. Light had to do with the correct understanding, while being in darkness meant that you lacked knowledge. In today's vernacular, one might compare it to the idea of red pill versus blue pill. This light versus darkness motif is expanded by Paul as well as other New Testament writers. Keywords for light were day, awake, arise, and seeing, while keywords for darkness were night, sleep, bed, and blind. What I'm proposing is that Jesus used this light versus darkness motif in his teachings as well. But the original meaning is lost because the gospel writers used a propaganda technique that I refer to as the literal figurative switcheroo. By taking an expression that was originally figurative and then switching it to a literal meaning, an author can change the meaning to better fit his agenda. We see this technique used in the Bible, especially with sexual euphemisms. In the biblical narrative, Sisera laying between Jael's feet was changed from a sexual euphemism to Sisera literally laying between her feet. And Samson's plowed with my heifer and grinding seed were manipulated to be taken literally as well. The gospel writers seem to be doing the same by taking metaphorical terms that Jesus used and turning them into literal events. This was the genesis for the miracles of Jesus, as I'll show in a bit. But what did darkness and light metaphorically refer to in Jesus' teachings? It was the same as with Paul. It had to do with knowledge and understanding. And in this case, it was the knowledge and understanding of the teachings of Jesus. What did Jesus teach exactly? That's hard to ascertain. Obviously, we can read the Gospels to read what they wanted us to think he taught. But isolating his actual teachings takes a bit of work. However, in general, I think we conclude that Jesus originally taught the following. The Jewish king needed to be replaced in order to establish the kingdom of God. Check out my video, The Lost Teachings of Jesus, to learn more on that point. Sometimes we can see the remnants of the effects of the teachings of Jesus better than we can ascertain the teachings themselves. In this regard, it seems that the teachings of Jesus caused slaves to leave their masters, spouses to leave their marriages, and a disregard for the law of Moses, specifically the Sabbath rest and dietary laws. According to Jesus and his followers, understanding his original teachings brought one out of the darkness and into the light. I'll go through some examples from the Gospel of Mark. In Mark 1:29-31, it says Jesus healed Simon's mother-in-law and raised her up. You'll see this frequently in Mark, where Jesus not just heals, but will raise them up as well. This is the author of Mark taking stories about Jesus teaching someone and turning them into stories about physical healing and miracles. The author will often add details to try to shift the reader away from a metaphorical understanding. In this case, Jesus physically takes Simon's mother-in-law by the hand to raise her up. In Mark 2:10b-12, Jesus heals a paralyzed man and tells him to take up his pallet and go home. And again in Mark 6:54-55, it talks about how those who were sick were brought on their pallets. The word for pallet here, sometimes translated as mat or bed, ties in with the light versus darkness metaphorical framework. The author of Mark, once again, takes the story about Jesus metaphorically waking someone up and turns it into a physical healing. The opening of the eyes was also part of the metaphorical framework. Not only was it a powerful metaphor in and of itself, but it also tied in with the sleep and awake part of the framework. In Mark 10:49b-52, Jesus literally heals a blind man. This is a manipulation of a story about someone understanding the teachings of Jesus. They once were blind without his teachings, but now they see. We may have some indication of which scriptures that Jesus used to support his teachings. In Mark 4:12, Jesus quotes Isaiah, although the author of Mark adds a bit at the end in order to better fit his agenda. And in Mark 13:24, Jesus quotes from Isaiah again, But again, the author of Mark manipulates it by shifting the time period. Using the metaphorical framework, we can also get a hint of the origins of the ministry of Jesus. Jesus himself was in darkness at one time, asleep but woken up. Mark 4:37 through 39 says that Jesus was asleep during a storm, but that they woke him up and he commanded the storm to stop. What was once a story about a metaphorical storm that metaphorically woke up Jesus was manipulated by the author and turned into a literal storm that literally woke up Jesus from a literal sleep. Metaphorical meaning is what allowed for the scenario at the beginning of this video. Jesus had risen even before he was crucified because he had metaphorically woken up, and his teachings would help usher in the kingdom of God. So then, after Jesus was crucified, it was an easy manipulation for the author to shift away from the metaphorical meaning to a literal resurrection from the dead. Additionally, with sleep being a euphemism for death, it was an easy manipulation to turn it into literal death. This occurs in a couple of other places in Mark as well, but the author has to include the metaphorical language of Jesus, which causes the author to have to clarify if he means a metaphorical sleep or a literal death. In Mark 9:9 through 10, the disciples asked each other what Jesus meant when he said rising from the dead. In Mark 9:25 through 27, the author takes the metaphorical meaning of sleep and turns it into death so that Jesus can perform a resurrection. The same occurs in Mark 5:39 through 41. The sleep metaphor shows up again in Mark 14:37, but this time it's not changed to a literal death, but to a literal sleep when Peter, James, and John can't stay awake. Even the reference to the rooster in connection with Peter's denials is a reference to the metaphorical framework of light and darkness, as the crow of the rooster signals the rising sun. But in Mark 14:72, it's changed to a literal rooster. Finally, after Jesus was crucified, he was no longer able to metaphorically wake people up, so there was a metaphorical darkness. But the author of Mark changes it to a literal darkness. This raises the question of how large was this metaphorical framework? Did it extend beyond just light and darkness? How many other words were originally meant to be taken metaphorically, but were changed to literal by the biblical authors? And does it extend beyond the Gospels and go into the book of Acts? Be sure to subscribe to my channel as I explore the original stories behind the biblical narratives. In the meantime, check out my video on the lost teachings of Jesus. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.